Well, today we are picking up probably in our first of two last sessions in Judges. Last week we introduced Samson in his birth narrative story in chapter 13. And as we read that, we commented that as we hear this story, there's a lot of expectations that we have of Samson. Samson's mother is visited by an angel and told that she's going to bear a son even though she's barren. Told that he's to be a Nazirite, he's supposed to be essentially an offering to God. He's not to cut his hair, he's not to drink strong wine, he's to live a different kind of lifestyle. And we heard the story that the father, he kind of questions this, he wants to know for certain. He asked the angel to come back, and it comes back to the wife, and then she comes and gets him. And he's still not totally convinced, but finally he is. And they have the child, they dedicate the child, and they name him Samson. And he grew up, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahaneh-dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So 14, we might expect like a really powerful story of somebody who is going to do something great. The story reminds us of stories of the Old Testament, of those that have been chosen at birth, those like Samuel. But here we get a different kind of story. However, throughout the story, as we'll read today, God is still working, even as Samson in many ways works against what his calling has been. So I want us to think about, as we read the story, I want us to see in parallel how Samson in many ways represents Israel itself. Israel's been called out by God. Israel continues to do things that's against God's will. Yet God continues to use Israel and blesses Israel. Even when Israel essentially falls apart, God still comes back and works. So I want us to hear the story of Samson. We'll start in chapter 14, and I'll make comments as we go. All of y'all are familiar with this story, but I want us to read it as though we've not read it before. Once Samson went down to Tamir, and at Tamir he saw a Philistine woman. So the first story we really get of Samson is that he does what? His eyes are attracted to a woman outside of Israel. Then he came up and told his father and mother, "I saw a Philistine woman at Tamir. Now go get her for me as my wife." But his father and mother said to him, "Is there not a woman among your kin or among all of our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" Now come on, little buddy. You mean there's not a woman out here amongst our people that doesn't attract your eye? Why this woman? I mean, just imagine, Mom and Dad have grown up knowing that this is to be a child special to Israel, to conquer and defeat the Philistines. That's his purpose in life. And what does he want? To marry the enemy? Oh my goodness. Come on, buddy. But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me because she pleases me." Now, throughout the story of Samson, we'll see that Samson in many ways models Israel. What is Israel's constant doing? They do what? Evil in the sight of the Lord. And as they do evil in the sight of the Lord, it's for their own what? Own selfishness. Whether it's idol worship, whether it's marrying outside of Israel, whether it's all of those things, it's that selfishness that pits in them. Go get her for me because she pleases me. His father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord. So the text tells us that his stirring is pushed by the Lord. And we're going to ask ourselves why. Why does God constantly within the story of Samson go against what God's already ordered Israel to do? For he was seeking a pretext to act against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Tamir, and when he came to the vineyards of Tamir, suddenly a young lion roared at him. So most of us are somewhat familiar with this part of the story. The Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he tore the lion apart barehanded, as one might tear a kid. So we can imagine, the lion comes up, and he just grabs the lion and just rips him in half. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson. After a while, he returned to marry her. So he comes back along the same way he went, and there lying is the carcass of the lion. Now, the Old Testament is that you don't what? You don't touch dead things. Dead things are unclean. You definitely don't eat just dead things. After a while, he returned to marry her. He turned aside to see the carcass of a lion, and there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went. He reminds us in many ways, this is the one who's been chosen by God. He reminds us of the story of Gideon, of the men who lap out, food out of like dogs. This is not a becoming of a gentleman, is it? To take honey out of a dead carcass and just lap it up. I mean, Samson, so far within the story, doesn't seem to be, if you go back to Judges, the beginning of Judges, Othniel, who's kind of the first judge, who's kind of an exemplary figure, marries within his own community, who judges wisely. Samson so far just seems to be kind of a brute. He scraped it out into his hands and went on eating as he went. And when he came to his father and mother, he gave some of them, and they ate it. So he gives something defiled to his parents, and they, not knowing where it came from, they eat it. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the carcass of the lion. So far, Samson doesn't appear to be most upright fellow. Now his father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, as young men were accustomed to do. So they're going to have a feast, a marriage feast, and when the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them, "Let me put a riddle to you. If you can explain to me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you will give me 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments." So they said to him, "Ask your riddle, let us hear it." And he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." So we know as the audience what he's talking about. He's talking about the lion that is strong, and out of it came something to eat, which was the honey. Now he makes a riddle to these people he's probably never met. These Philistines that have shown up to be a part of this wedding festivity. And out of nowhere, he makes a bet that's really unreasonable. That's a lot. It's more than most of them have. So they make a bet, and as time goes by, they begin to struggle trying to figure out the riddle. But for 3 days, they could not explain the riddle. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, so it's been 4 days, and time's running out. They know if they don't win that something bad's going to happen. "Coax your husband and explain the riddle to us, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire." These are guests at the wedding. Samson's not necessarily hanging out with the best lot, is he? If you don't explain to us, we're not going to lose this bet. If you don't find out what we need to know, we're going to burn you and your father's house. Now this is a woman that he has married who is being asked to do what? Betray him. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? They think, oh, you've invited us here so that we'll go home empty-handed. So Samson's wife wept before him, saying, "You hate me. You do not really love me. You have asked a riddle of my people, but you have not explained it to me." So what does she do? She tries to coerce Samson into giving up a secret. So this story gets another parallel within the story of Delilah. You've got a secret. Don't you love me? I'm your wife. He said to her, "Look, I have not told my father or my mother. Why should I tell you?" She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted, and because she nagged him on the seventh day, he told her. So let's just imagine Samson has chosen this Philistine woman. She's not really had any say-so. He's married her, and now he has put her in danger. So the story of her and Delilah are very different, and we'll come back to it. But she is in mortal danger, at least she fears, in her father's house. Samson has put her in danger by coming and marrying her and asking this bet within the local community. And for the next day, she pesters him, that word nagged him, over and over till he gives what? He gives up and just what? Tells her. Samson himself is not very strong-willed, is he? We'll see this over and over again. Him and women, he's just not strong-willed. Then the men of the seventh day he told her, then she explained the riddle to her people. The men of the town said to him on the seventh day before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" So they answer it, and they answer the challenge. He said to him, "If you have not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." Notice how he talks about his wife. So within the story of Judges, what we'll see is a degrading of how even women are treated as the social framework of the Israelites as they continue to get farther and away from God. Those earlier stories, women are seen as admirable and honorable, as powerful. They use their gifts and abilities, whether it is Deborah, whether there's the one who kills the general with the peg. By this time we see that the women are either vulnerable, like this one, or they're like Delilah, where they use their own skills and abilities for their own gain. And we'll see even worse as we go along. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and he went to Ashkelon. And he killed 30 men of the town, took their spoil, gave the festal garments to those who he had explained the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So he gets this fit of anger. He goes to a place that has nothing to do with him, murders the people, steals their stuff, brings it as payment for his lost what? Wager, and then storms off angrily and leaves his wife after their marriage. And she's vulnerable, and she's given over to his best man. That's not a very good wedding, is it? No. Throughout the story, we see Samson just kind of responding out of anger, out of revenge. When we read the story, all I can think of when I think of Samson is just the kind of people you know who's kind of just big and brutish. They don't have a whole lot going on up here. And how do they react? They usually react out of their emotions. And here he reacts out of his emotion, even though the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him. He doesn't understand throughout the narrative until later that it's God's Spirit working in him. He never prays for God's guidance until the end. It's just him reacting. But the Lord is keeping him safe for a purpose. So he's left his wife. He's gone back to his parents' house. You've got to imagine how they're feeling. You know, we went and got the woman for you. Now you're back here. You know, they're probably questioning, did the angel really mean for him? I mean, he's just not living up to our expectations. But after a while, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife, bringing along a kid. So, time's gone by. It's time of the harvest for the Philistines. And feeling kind of lonely, probably. And we'll see a similar story later. And he brings a gift. Brings a young kid with him, a baby goat. And he said, I want to go to my wife's room. So he shows up. He's wanting to spend some time with his wife. But her father would not allow him to go in. Now you can imagine, just within the narrative of the story, the father's frustration. Not only have you abandoned my daughter, you brought a lot of shame on our family. Essentially, the next town over, he killed everybody. I mean, it's just like, oh, he came back. You can imagine the humor, a little bit of humor in the story. Her father said, I was not sure that you had rejected her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister prettier than she? So her father's trying to figure out how is he going to appease old Samson. Listen, we didn't think he was coming back. We went ahead and gave her over to somebody else as, she needs a husband. I can't keep taking care of her all the time. She's got a younger sister. Don't you think she's pretty attractive, don't you think? I mean, he's obviously there for a reason, and it's not because he loves her. Why not take her instead? Notice the father is not the best father either. Samson said to them, this time when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame. So he's upset. Now what he did last time, he kind of admits, it was kind of foolish, going out to that other Philistine town, murdering those people because I did a bad wager. But this time, I'm without blame. He's upset. He's going to get vengeance. Now remember, it's the time of the harvest. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes. Now, just imagine sitting around the campfire hearing this story. How many? 100? No. 200? No. 300 foxes. No way. And what does he do? He turned the foxes tail to tail. So we can just imagine him trying to tie them together. And put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards the olive oil grows. Now notice what God's doing. God's using him against Israel's enemy. But how is Samson behaving? Like a child. Like an angry child. He doesn't give any thought to what he's doing. It's just a kind of this reactionary thing. But what has he essentially done? He's essentially taken all of their food. Then the Philistines asked, who has done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Temanite, because he has taken Samson's wife and given her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. All right, they're frustrated. Our harvest is gone. Who's done this? Well, it's kind of this guy's fault. He kind of made him mad. That was his wife, and he gave him away. What the people had already promised to her when she tries to get the riddle, they eventually do. They burn her and her father. Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I will swear I will not stop until I have taken revenge on you. He struck them down hip and thigh with great slaughter, and he went down and stayed at the cleft of the rock of Edom. So they come and burn and kill his kind of wife and his kind of father-in-law. He's already been mad at them. He takes revenge on all of the Philistines. Now they take revenge on what? The father-in-law and the bride. And now he takes revenge on all of them. And he slaughters them. It's kind of a messy story. And afterwards he goes into hiding in some rocks. He hides in a cleft of a rock. And the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Leah. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come against us?" And they said, "We have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." So the Philistines are the great power oppressive to the Israelites, and they've come up to Judah and said, "Listen, we're going to oppress you even more if you don't give us Samson." Well, they're kind of in a pickle. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom, and they said to Samson, "Do you know that the Philistines are ruler over us? What have you done to us?" And he replied, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." So Samson's out in the cleft of the rock, and they need some people to go talk to him. You know, we'd imagine 5 or 10 probably be enough for one person. They send 3,000. "We've come down to bind you," they said to him, "so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." Now we just imagine Samson Samson answered, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me." And they said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now, remember that 2 new ropes. It comes back later. Okay? So they bind him with ropes, and they're going to bring him to the Philistines. And he says, "Don't try to kill me." I mean, Samson's not trying to fight against his own people. When he came to Leah, the Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him again. Now notice, he's not praying to God for help, but Lord helps him anyway. And the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that was caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. Then he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, another unclean thing. He reached down and took it, and he killed 1,000 men. And Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men." So within the story of Judges, Samson is unbeatable. Now, so far we know that Samson has done things that go against his calling as a Nazirite, someone who's been set aside by birth. He's not supposed to have strong drink. It appears probably at his wedding ceremony, the implication is that they were drinking. He's not supposed to do certain things like mess with unclean things, but he does it. So far, the only real thing he's not done, he married an outsider, is cut his hair. And God is still using him, but notice, even after he's done this horrible thing of killing 1,000 men, most of us with the jawbone, the Lord leads him to do it, but still, he mocks them. He makes a little rhyme in the Hebrew: "With the jawbone of a donkey, heap upon reaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men." You can just imagine him as he's leaving. He's just laughing and singing about the deed he just did. And when he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone at the place was called Ramathath Leah. But then he was very thirsty. Killing 1,000 people might make you a little parched. It's a lot of work. And he called on the Lord. Finally, he calls on God. But what is he calling on God for? "You have granted this great victory by the hand of your servant. Now I am now to die of thirst and fall in the hands of the uncircumcised." So God split open the hollow place that is at Leah, and water came from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore it was named Anik Hakor, that is the spring of the one who called, which is Eliah to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. It'd be nice if that was the end of the story in some ways. Finally, he's called on the Lord, he's replenished, and he judges for 20 years. But we get a continued story, and the story of his downfall and also his redemption. So once Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute and went into her. So when Samson sees something, what does Samson do? He takes it. Now, if we go back and we remember our story from the book of Joshua, the spies go into Jericho and they meet a prostitute who helps them. But they go in seeking the will of God, and they don't use the person as an object, but as an accomplice of somebody that is a person, and they make good promises. And in that story, we know the walls fall of Jericho. Here, we've got a kind of a similar story, but kind of an opposite is true. Samson goes into the city, sees something he wants, and takes it. Takes a prostitute. So the city people, the Gazites, were told Samson has come here. Now Samson's got a reputation. You know, everywhere he goes, he kills people. So they circled around and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They kept quiet all night, thinking, let us wait until the light of morning, then we will kill him. But Samson lay only until midnight. Then at midnight he rose up, took hold of the doors of the city gate, the two posts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. So unlike the story in Joshua, this story, Samson takes advantage of the prostitute. He leaves in the middle of the night, and he takes down essentially the entrance gates where the people would have met for the local justice and local worship and all the things. He essentially tears down the city wall and takes it and puts it up somewhere else. So he does a similar deed, but in a very different way. And after this, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. So we get these two separate stories. He's been reigning for 20 years. We get the story of the prostitute. Now we get the story of Delilah. And if we go back throughout the narrative of Samson, it is always women, the story of women is centered around women, that he continues to what? Yeah. And it's here we aren't told necessarily, there's some ambiguity within the text of who Delilah is. Where does she come from? Is she an Israelite? Is she a Philistine? It's not explicit. But whatever she is deceiving. And she's not out for Samson, she's out for who? Very much like who? Samson. It's amazing how Samson attracts someone like himself. The lords of the Philistines came to her and said. So in the other story of his Philistine wife, the townspeople say, if you don't give us his secret, then we're going to kill you and what? And your father. In this story, what do the people say? Coax him and find out what makes his strength so great, that we may overpower him, so that we may bind him in order to subdue him. And we each will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So it's not her life that she's enticed by, it's what? Money, wealth. So Delilah said to Samson, Please tell me what makes your strength so great, how you could be bound so that one could subdue you. Now, Samson ain't the smartest cookie in the jar. But he knows better than to tell anybody his secret. That's like Superman just telling people kryptonite kills me. Don't tell, I mean, what kind of woman would ask that?
Why did you look at me when you said that?
I was just looking around. Do I need to call Ray? Samson said to her, so instead of giving her the truth, he gives her some non-truth. And Samson, not being smart, doesn't learn his lesson on the first go-around. But that's... If the lords of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried out, and she bound him with them, while men were lying in wait in an inner chamber, she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. Oh, let me go back. I skipped something. Oh, no. So he tells, if you tie me up with these dried out bowstrings, I shall become weak. So she does it. Now, I can imagine, within the story, it doesn't say it, I can just imagine Samson laying there, just kind of grinning, as she does it. I mean, you know, he doesn't, I don't know, Anyway, the lords of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not dried out. She bound him with them. He's either a heavy sleeper. While the men were lying in wait in an inner chamber, she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps its torches, so the secret of the strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you could be bound. And he said to her, if you bind me with new ropes, remember those new ropes we already know within the story, they don't work. If you bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. The men lying in wait were in the inner chamber. But he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. We can just imagine him laughing at her. He's not aware that there are men in the next room. But he just finds it funny that she's continuing to subdue him. Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you could be bound. He said to her, if you weave 7 locks of my head with web and make it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else. So I want us to listen to what he's saying. He's getting close. But not only that, if you were to, weave my 7 locks of my hair into a web and then make it tight with the pin. The pin, what he's talking about, is the same peg of the tent that was what? Remember the story? Yeah. So he's putting himself in a position of vulnerability to his Delilah. He's getting close with the truth. And he's saying if you use that peg, you can tighten it. And we can just imagine, as we're reading the story, that we know the truth as the audience. He's getting a little too close to telling her what's going to make him vulnerable. If we'd never heard this story before, the first couple of times it's funny. Now we're kind of getting a little nervous as we're hearing the story. What's he doing? Why is he getting close to his hair? He should stay away from that. But he doesn't. So while he slept, Delilah took 7 locks of his head, wove them into the web, and made them tight with the pin. Then she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep, pulled away the pin and loom and the web. Then she said to him, how can you say, I love you, when your heart is not with me? Oh, my. That's a hard thing to hear. That's manipulation right there. You say you love me, but you're not telling me the truth. You can just, Samson's this big, brutish man, but for some reason he really likes this woman. And he's been playing with her the whole time. When your heart is not with me, you have mocked me 3 times now and not told me what makes your strength so great. Finally, after she nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. So the woman uses words to continually weaken Samson until he is tired to death of her complaints. This man who is strong enough to kill 1,000 men is subdued by a woman's words.
Manipulation.
So within the story, even though Delilah is not depicted as a virtuous woman, we see where her strength comes from. She wears him down. So he told her his whole secret and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me, and I would become weak and be like anyone else." Why, Samson? Why? When Delilah realized that he had told her his whole secret, she went and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "This time come up, for he has told me his whole secret." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. And she let him fall asleep on her lap. Remember the story of the other one, the general who shows up at the house. Like a mother. And Samson lays in Delilah's lap as though a child asleep. She let him fall asleep on her lap, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. And he began to weaken, and his strength left him. And then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And when he awoke from sleep, he thought, "I would go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. And they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the meal in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. So this mighty judge of Israel is subdued by a woman's love. She tricks him at night, gets his hair cut. He wakes up not realizing what has happened. He realizes his weakness is gone. The Philistines bound him up. So he's betrayed by his beloved. He's bound up, and they gouge out his eyes. And he is made to work as a slave, a blind slave, doing what? Grinding at the mill. In the ancient world, that was woman's work. So he's essentially become, his strength is taken away, his eyesight is gone, and now he's made a slave to do what? What a woman normally would do. Can't get any worse than that. I mean, not that being a woman, I'm not meaning that. Don't take it that way. But for somebody who has not had any real worry about life, just done what he's always wanted to do, now he's a slave. In many ways, the story of Samson models the story of Israel. Israel has constantly chosen something other to God to put their faith in. And God continually uses them even when they're what? Doing evil in the sight of the Lord. But there's a point where God seems to leave them. And here the Spirit of the Lord leaves Samson. And he essentially goes into exile. He goes into bondage. And it feels like God's abandoned him. And Israel at times has felt abandoned after they've turned away from God. But the story of God and God's people is that God always what? Comes back. Well, the Philistines have cut his hair, but they've not realized that it's going to grow back. So little by little it grows back and his strength returns. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When you read the book of 1 Samuel, the Philistines and their God come back. But here they're going to offer essentially Samson as a great sacrifice to their God. When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." Now the Israelites would say that the Philistines are their enemy, who have been ravaging their land. And it will be their God who will deliver. And by the end of the story, it's a what? It's a reversal. And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson, let him entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. And they made him stand between the pillars. So Samson becomes a spectacle to them. They mock him. They jeer him. When the people are in Babylon, the Babylonians say, "Sing us some of those songs you used to sing in Israel," mocking them when they were happy and joyful. Here, the people, like those that will come after Samson, are ridiculed. So Samson stands between two pillars. And Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests so that I may lean against them." Samson once again becomes a trickster within the story. We know that his hair is growing back, that he is getting stronger. And he pretends to be the person who has led him away. "Show me where the pillar is. I is tired and weak. I need to lean against it for strength." Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. Now listen, finally Samson calls out to the Lord for more than himself. And Samson's going to ask the request that others ask within the Old Testament narrative. Jeremiah will ask for it. Jonah will ask for it. Others will ask for it, but none will be given it in the way that Samson gets it. "Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this one act of revenge, I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Now notice his motivation. Still revenge. Even at the end of his life, he can't see beyond that. He's still blind in many ways. Yeah. And Samson grasped with the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Other prophets will ask for it. Others will ask, "Let me just die." But it served no purpose for God in those instances. This one does. And he gives his life as essentially a sacrifice. Motivation is revenge. But he does the very thing that God said he would do. Defeat the Philistines. Just imagine all of them are there. All the leaders of the different tribes of the Philistines are there. They're there to worship their God, to pay sacrifice, to mock Israel by mocking Samson. And he cries out for help. And Samson grasps the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, And he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down, took him and brought him up and buried him between Zor and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. In those 20 years, he had victories over Philistines out of revenge. In his last story, he defeats the Philistines in a way that none of us would have expected at the beginning of his birth narrative. Yet God still uses him to accomplish what God had promised. And the enemy that had been oppressive over Israel is now defeated. By the time we get back to the story of Samuel, they're back in power again. What I want us to think about is how that even in this end of Samson's life, when we read back over it, he doesn't appear to be judging much in the way that we would expect. He doesn't lead any armies. It's always what? Self-motivated. So he's the last judge in the book of Judges. And it goes from a very good judge, Othniel, all the way to Samson. And we see within the story the breakdown of the judges as a model of the breakdown of Israel itself. And the next stories are going to show us how bad it gets in Israel when there was no king over Israel. And we'll tell one more story. So look in chapter 17. We're going to tell a different story. There was a man in the hill country of Ephraim. So we're not telling a judge story. We're just telling a story of how bad it gets. There was a man in the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and even spoke in it in my hearing, that silver is in my possession." So we're just introduced to this man, and he goes to his mother and says, "Mama, you remember all that silver that was stolen from you? Remember that curse you made on it?" "Ah, it was me. I stole it." Now, if you was mama, what you going to do?
Smack him upside the head.
Yeah, you going to whoop him or something. See what his mama does. He says, "I will return it." His mother said, "May my son be blessed by the Lord." It's almost comical. It is comical. She has cursed the person who stole it. The person that stole it gave it back, and she blesses him. Things are backwards in these times. This is the beginning of a story that we just see. This doesn't make sense. These times don't make sense in this time of Israel. Then he returned the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother, and his mother said, "Oh, she's so happy she got her silver back. What's she going to do with it?" "I will consecrate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son to make an idol of cast metal." So when he returned the money to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave it to her silversmith, who made it into an idol of cast metal, and it was in the house of Micah. Now notice several things here. First, she's so happy she's going to bless him. She promises she's going to make something from it. She's going to take all of it and make something. She only takes 200 pieces of silver. And then she takes it and she makes an idol, and she gives it to her son to put in his house. So here in the time of Israel, the parent-children relationship seemed to be out of whack. The blessings and cursings seem to be out of whack. And the promises made by a mother are not fulfilled, even when she's doing something she shouldn't be doing, making an idol. The man Micah had a shrine. He made an ephod and a teraphim and installed one of his sons who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. So he sets up a little shrine at his house. He installs his son as the priest to make the sacrifices to his idol. Now there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the clan of Judah. He was a Levite residing there. So he's a priestly class. This man left the town of Bethlehem in Judah to live wherever he could find a place. He's a wanderer. And he came to the house of Micah in the hill country of Ephraim to carry on his work. Micah said to him, "From where do you come?" He replied, "I'm a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to live wherever I can find a place." Then Micah said to him, "Stay with me and be to me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, set of clothes, and your living." So Micah essentially sees this guy as a possible candidate to help lead him in worship. He's a Levite. And the Levite essentially will lead in worship for what? A price. Things aren't the way they should be. The Levite agreed to stay with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. So Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest and was in the house of Micah. And Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will prosper me because the Levite has become my priest." So not only has he got an idol, he's paying a priest to enact worship around his shrine. And he thinks the Lord's going to bless him. It's out of whack. It's out of order. Everything is breaking down. In those days, there was no king of Israel. In those days, the tribe of the Danites were seeking for itself a territory to live in. For until then, no territory among the tribes of Israel had been allotted to them. So if you go back and read in Joshua, you know the Danites they're not the best tribe, and they weren't given land, so they're looking for some land. They're wandering just like what? The Levite. So the Danites sent 5 valiant men from the whole number of their clan, from Zor and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and explore it. And they said to them, "Go explore the land." And when they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, they stayed there. So a similar story of spies going out looking at the land. And while they were at Micah's house, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. So they went over and asked him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?" And he said to them, "Micah did such and such for me, and he has hired me, and I have become his priest." And they said to him, "Inquire of God that we may know whether this mission we are undertaking will succeed." So this for-hired priest is given the task of seeking God's counsel on if they are to succeed in going into the land. The priest replied, "Go in peace. The mission you are on is under the eye of the Lord." It's not a very good oracle. It doesn't really say one way or another, does it? 5 men went on. When they came to Laish, they observed the people who were living securely after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking of nothing on earth and possessing wealth. Furthermore, they were far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with Aram. When they came to their kinfolk at Zor and Eshtaol, they said to them, "What do you report?" So unlike the spies that go into Canaan with Joshua and Caleb, who go into the land and see the people there as giants and they to be grasshoppers, these people go in the land and what they see is a bunch of essentially overfed, unprotected group of folks. "What do you report?" They said, "Come, let us go against them, for we have seen the land, and it is very good. Will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, but enter and possess the land. When you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is broad. God has indeed given into your hands a place where there is no lack of anything on the earth. 600 men from the Danite clan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zor and Eshtaol and went up and encamped at Kiriath-jearim in Judah. And on this account, that place is called Menhadan to this day. It is west of Kiriath-jearim. From there they passed on to the hill country of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. So these 600 men are moving towards the land they're going to take from these unsuspecting people. They get to the house of Micah. The 5 men who had gone out to spy the land, that is Lachish, said to their comrades, "Do you know that in these buildings there's an ephod, teraphim, an idol of cast metal? There's a shrine here of idols. Now therefore consider what you will do." So they turned in that direction and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah and greeted him. While the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate, the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land proceeded to enter and to take the idol of cast metal, the ephod, and the teraphim. And the priest was standing by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. And the men went into Micah's house and took the idol of cast metal, ephod, and the teraphim. The priest said to them, "What are you doing?" And they said to him, "Keep quiet. Put your hand over your mouth and come with us and be to a father and a priest. It is better for you to be a priest to the house of one person or to a priest to the tribe of the clan of Israel." And the priest accepted the offer. He took the ephod, the teraphim, and the idol and went along with the people. So they come to this house and steal an idol and the priest, because they're wanting to use them for their own what? Advantage. So they resumed their journey, putting the little ones, the livestock, and the goods in front of them. And when they were some distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the house near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the Danites. And they shouted to the Danites, who turned around and said to Micah, "What is the matter that you would come with such company?" He replied, "You take my gods that I made and the priest and go away, and what have I left? How then can you ask me what is the matter?" And the Danites said to him, "You had better not let your voice be heard among us, or else hot-tempered fellows will attack you, and you will lose your life and the lives of your household." Then the Danites went their way. And when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. Now it's interesting, within the story, Micah feels what? Betrayed. They've stolen his idols, which were made from the very thing he stole from his mother. It's a cycle of what? Violence, a cycle of that just gets repeated over and over again. He's not mad. He's mad that they have stolen something from him, which at the end of the day was false worship. And they are stealing false worship to take along with them. The Danites, having taken the Micah that had made and the priests who belonged to them, came to Lachish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, put them to sword and burned down the city. So they go and they defeat a people who were not ready to make war. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon. And they had no dealings with Aram. And it was in the valley that belonged to Beth-rub. And they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan after the ancestor Dan who was born in Israel. But the name of the city was formerly Laish. And then the Danites set up the idols for themselves. Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests of the tribe of the Danites until the time the land went into captivity. That was done under the Assyrians. So they maintained it as their own, Micah's idol that had made, as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So we get to the end of 18, and the people are what? Are degrading. They're becoming worse and worse. They're fighting amongst themselves, not against necessarily outside enemies. They're making idols of worship to where the early judges were breaking them down. They're building them up. And much of Israel is just what? It's about what? It's self-motivated, self-seeking, self-possessing. So when we get to chapter 19, which is by far one of the hardest stories of the Bible, we can see how far it degrades down before we get to the time of Samuel. Comments, questions? Let me close in prayer if y'all have any. Just for those online, next week we'll end our study in Judges, and then we'll begin moving on to some other things. We're glad that you were with us today. Let me close this in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you again for another day, another opportunity to be together both in person and online, to study your word, and to hear it with new ears and new eyes and new hearts. Continue to allow your word to shape us, to form us, to know and to be and to do the things that you would have us know and be and do, not just as individuals, but as a community of faith. Lord, we ask that you'll continue to guide and direct our hearts over the week and bring us back together. We pray this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.